or in the election before, in 2014, that you had 3 candidates and they were separated by under 50 votes. Another anecdote, very early when I moved to Bowen, there was an election and Larry Reid was running against Patrick Thomas for the GVRD director. And there was a meeting at Collins Hall, which was, of course, the community center back then. And there was an artist on Bowen named Tommy Johnson, who was big, tall American with long hair. And he made a sign in the form of a heart. And on one side, it said hippies for Larry Reid, and the other side, it said hippies for Patrick Thomas. And so the poor candidates were up in front staring out at this audience, which had quite a lot of the hippies in it, and not wanting their support at all, wanting to appeal to, in fact, the mainstream. And they would see, hippies for Larry Reid. So Patrick Thomas would be very pleased that at least, he was not identified with that. But then, of course, once his turn came to talk, it got flipped around. And then he ended up just sort of flipping it back and forth and back and forth. And everybody broke out in laughter, of course. So, that has not changed, all that polarity. It just takes different forms. So it used to be pro-development, anti-development. There was the Bowen Island Improvement Association and the Conservancy types, and the difference now, I think, is more along the political spectrum or continuum of public interest versus private interests or private, property rights. And we tend to be, on the public interest side of things. But in every council, we have seen people who really strongly espouse, they want less government. They don't like the island's trust. They don't want to be told what to do. They just want to be left alone. So I would say we're a much more complex community. We have far more facilities. It's really interesting what the diversity actually is on the island, even though it is fairly limited racially. And it is people self-select, and it is undoubtedly a privileged place to be. Not most people just simply couldn't live here because of their obligations and work. But I think that everybody who lives here actually cares for the community one way or another. It used to be much simpler. There were what I would call the settlers, the families that came and homesteaded and logged and, eked out a living, and then who worked for the Union Steamship Company at the turn of the 20th century. And then there were the rich families who were mostly down at the South End and Hood Point. And those are dynasties, and it's icons of Canadian business, the Malkins and the Molsons and the Sodders and the Rogers Sugar, families like that who they've been there since like the 1870s, 1880s. And they staked out territories, and they are very much entrenched. What happened with the settlers and the people was that their descendants mostly ended up being service workers or construction, or they're the ones that operated the equipment on the island. So, they're the ones, if you look around, and there's Dorman Road and Davies Orchard and a lot of those Smith Road. Those are named after families that are still, Twin Island Excavation is still owned by a Davies. And they were and remain part of that community. So there were the rich people that came, and then there were the descendants of settlers. And on top of that, then came the weekenders. And so I guess that, started with the Union Steamship. But later on in the 60s, when you started getting these developments, so whether it was Davies down in Melmore and Lenora, or Tunstall Bay, or Ernie Nod doing Blue Water, they attracted people who mostly came for the weekends, and a few stayed. And then the final layer were the largely younger renters. There were lots of rental cabins when I arrived. You could get a place for $80 to $100 a month in one of the old Union Steamship cabins, and it had an oil stove, and you fixed it up. And there are a bunch of people, including Judy Getty, who moved here and lived in places like that. Connie Wright lived in one of those places, and they still stick around, and they've definitely, their circumstances have changed. So there was that. And now you have, there were six, the first ferry in the morning left at 6:45. And there were half a dozen cars on it. And now we have overloads. So those are the major changes.
So where do you think we're headed as a community? When you say we punch above our weight, I know we've got an incredibly talented brain trust on the island with big players in just about every sector. We don't seem to be policy leaders in the region, province, or country. So how come?
Well, I wouldn't say that we aren't policy. We may be informally, we're not policy leaders, but there are, by example, we lead. One of these, and I keep swinging back to political stuff, is our first past the post alteration for having double direct voting. And we do that for the Islands Trust. And that is unique. It is an extra layer of government that we have here. But the way that we exercise choice in elections could be used as a leadership model. But why that doesn't get translated into bigger picture stuff, we're just a small player. And I would actually argue that sometimes we are the tail that swings the cow.
So can you explain how the cow became a municipality and how it interacts with the Islands Trust?
The Islands Trust was enacted in 73, 74. So it was one of the things that the NDP did. The other was creating the Agricultural Land Reserve, which have actually endured despite there being considerable opposition. And previous to that, of course, regional districts were established, I think, in the early 60s, it was in the 60s. Before that, it was just sort of unincorporated areas, and they didn't have the regional districts. So GVRD was present on Bowen for all the time that I've been here. And, I was active with it from the early 90s, but certainly Ross Carter before that, and Gail Taylor was a regional director. George Hellenius in 1982 was a regional director, and he basically was the one who talked Crippen into selling his land, which was the remnants of the Union Steamship lands. So that was all under the aegis of GVRD. But GVRD also provided services on the island. They provided the recreation. They oversaw the sewer in the cove after it was built. They basically handled the Cove Bay water. Curiously, they didn't handle the other local service area water systems, but because Snug Cove was so much bigger than the other ones, they thought it not good enough to have it run by amateurs. So we had that impact from that level of government going back quite a long ways. So the Islands Trust, when it came in, it was quite a different beast than it became. And it was always to do with the same mandate of preserve and protect, which arose actually not under the NDP, but under the Social Credit before that. And one of the ministers, I think it was Ralph Lothmark, had a place over on Pender Island, and suddenly announced was Magic Lake Estates, which was 1,200 lots or 1,400 lots, something unbelievable. And it happened. It just got subdivided, and there was no regard for having, whether you could have proper setbacks or septic or any of those things. And it was actually the biggest subdivision that had ever been undertaken at one go. And Lothmark said, this is ridiculous. And they imposed the 10-acre freeze, which then led to the Islands Trust. And then the Islands Trust kind of tried on different hats before it was restructured. And it was always a creature of the provincial government. The Islands Trust Act, and they report directly to the Minister of Municipal Affairs. So they are a different order of government, or in fact, a higher order of government than regional districts or municipalities. And they started gaining more authorities, and particularly when they set up the local trust committees, they were authorized to administer all land use decision making. Metro Vancouver didn't do any of that before. It was all provincial government. The subdivision was the approving officer, who was a provincial appointee, and it usually actually was the head of highways in your area who was the approving officer, and they were mostly concerned about what your driveway looked like as it came onto the road. So the Islands Trust was the newbie on the block, no question about it. Remarkably, it's been around now for 50 years. I remember a minister of municipal affairs saying that he'd like to squash the trust like a bug. People either love it or don't like it. People often like the idea and don't like the way it works. And now it's being reviewed, and the external review basically pointed out a number of shortcomings. And I do truly hope that, the way it operates is updated. So how do we become a municipality? Under the Islands Trust, there was always that option that you could incorporate. And Bowen took a crack at it, and in the early 90s, and it was turned down. But towards the mid 90s, a couple of things changed. There were a lot of people, had moved to Bowen. Bowen was operated as an electoral area. And Metro just got sick and tired of dealing with our small problems and having to tie up both committees and also the General Assembly to deal with how are we going to handle this or that small question on Bowen. And one way of dealing with it was to impose a surcharge. So when they did their rec programming, they charged us, and it was a union shop. It was fairly high-priced help to begin with. So they ran that, and then they tacked on 27% as an admin fee. We were wanting to have a community center back then. That started in the 80s, but the early 90s, Don Nicholson drew up wonderful plans for a community center to be located right now where the bike park is, near the snake field beside the big school. And it was going to be like $4.8 million. And it was like, oh, that's way too big. But we did think that a smaller, just a hall, would be a good start. And that was to be located on what was called the library lot, which was hived off by Wolfgang in developing Kate's Hill, so that it's across from the Children's Center right at the beginning of Carter Road. And it still is an empty lot. So the idea was there was a referendum to pass to build that. And it was for $750,000. And it failed narrowly, largely because there was no entity other than if you set up a nonprofit society to administer the hall, and people were leery about that because they were worried about ownership. It would be putatively owned by GVRD, and it was turned down because they said, well, we don't want them to be running that. And so people had this idea they wanted more local control. So people will tell you all kinds of things. It was to get out of the trust, or that wasn't true. It was because we were an unwanted orphan child of Metro Vancouver, and they were making it difficult for us to continue the way we were. So we had a vote and it was 60-40. A lot of it was a pack of lies, that we were sold a bill of goods. We were told, we might have 12 full-time employees after 5 years, and we had a lot more than that. And now, 20 years later, we have close to 50 full-time employees. It's become a much bigger enterprise. And I think that's, part of the illness of governance is that bureaucracies grow. But that is why